Which brings me to the final part of this presentation. So yes, realizing that we have all this potential, how practically do we achieve it? How do we get bears into central Idaho in particular and ensure that they survive? Which brings me then to how do we bridge the Great Divide? So just reacquainting us with the configuration of the landscape. First of all, everything in light green here, every place that we have potential suitable habitat. Here, all of the modeled routes that bears could potentially use to disperse between that potential suitable habitat, where in fact we already have grizzly bears. Documented instances of dispersing colonizing grizzlies relative to our recovery areas where there's some sort of authoritative imprimatur for getting bears there and having them survive. Putting this all together then, we can identify areas that I'm calling connectors where we should logically focus if we want to achieve this broader vision of recovery or restoration. And importantly, the configuration of challenges and the derivative focus of restoration efforts is going to differ amongst these different connectors based on the configuration of habitats. So looking at first the connectors that overlap with the state of Idaho brings into relief a practice that occurs here that is fundamentally problematic. Overseen by Idaho Fish and Game, specifically, Idaho Fish and Game allows for baiting of black bears by hunters. And it's almost certainly the case that any place where we have this kind of bait out, it's going to attract grizzly bears, and whether a grizzly bear dies over this bait at the hands of a black bear hunter or not, it's probably going to become food conditioned, and because of that, it will transport that behavior to other circumstances where in turn it's more likely to die. So baiting of black bears is fundamentally incompatible with recovery of grizzly bears. And if we want grizzly bears, this practice probably needs to end in Idaho. Roads are a problem. Roads is a surrogate for where there are people. The more people, the more likely we are to have problems. But with a focus on Forest Service jurisdictions, here represented by everything in yellow as well as everything in burgundy. Yellow corresponds to roadless areas on Forest Service jurisdictions. Again, burgundy where we have roads on these jurisdictions. The darker the burgundy, the higher density of roads relative to a certain set of connectors then, within which management of roads on Forest Service lands is probably going to be the foremost restoration challenge. And we know that roads are problematic because of data we have from the Northern Continental Divide, but realizing up front that management of roads on Forest Service jurisdictions is intimately intertwined with industrial scale extraction of timber. Here, everything in burgundy is where we do have lands prioritized for timber production, where we have the highest densities of roads. So you overlay that with these black dots, each one representing where a grizzly bear was known to have died between 2004 and 2014, and you can just see on the basis of visual inspection that there's a disproportionate concentration of grizzly bear deaths in these areas with high road densities devoted to industrial scale extraction of timber. The point being that these sorts of landscapes perpetrated for these reasons are fundamentally problematic when it comes to restoring grizzly bears. So we need to do something about roads. And we do indeed know how to manage roads on Forest Service lands. Whether we obliterate them or not, we know how to effectively close them in ways that will result in increasing security not only for grizzly bears but for other wildlife. Then there are private lands, and there are minimal opportunities for the federal government to exert its authority on private lands, so we have a different configuration of challenges. And so we can then identify connectors where management of what happens on private lands or changes in practices on private lands are going to be the foremost challenge, largely on agricultural lands, especially related to agricultural attractants. And so what I've done here in red is highlight all of those agricultural lands that correspond with all of the connectors in the Northern Continental Divide. It's in these areas that probably we need to be focusing in terms of helping to effect change in practices. And we know how to do that effectively by virtue of nothing else of what's happened in the Blackfoot River drainage. Here we have the Blackfoot Challenge, a landowner-driven initiative constituted initially to deal with resource challenges such as weed management, water management, but as a derivative, they took on the challenge of increasing numbers of grizzly bears in this drainage. So here, focusing on the Blackfoot River drainage, each one of these red dots represents a grizzly bear that was sighted, observed during that period of colonization in the late 1900s, late 1990s into the early 2000s. Concentrated along riparian areas, and correspondingly in shades of lavender, that's where most of the agricultural related conflicts occurred as well, related to agricultural attractants. For example, beehives, calves, boneyards being places, typically ravines behind a ranch house, where carcasses of animals that had died for all sorts of reasons were dumped, and because of that tended to attract scavenging bears. The Blackfoot Challenge responded fairly proactively, deployed lots of electric fencing around beehives, calving areas, for example. They also developed an innovative initiative to collect carcasses, take them to a secure area, and literally compost them. All of this with fairly dramatic results. So here in this XY graph, what you're seeing for each year, the gray dots, the number of conflicts for that year, a period of fairly rapid exponential increase in numbers of conflicts during that period of colonization, culminating in 2003, which is around when that coexistence infrastructure was deployed with fairly dramatic positive results and in excess of 90% decline in numbers of conflicts, at the same time that they had increasing numbers of bears in the Blackfoot River drainage. So as chance would have it, the Blackfoot River drainage sits astride much of this potential connective habitat between ecosystems, and not by coincidence then, I would argue that each one of these lavender dots representing a dispersing, colonizing grizzly bear probably originated in the Blackfoot drainage, or disproportionate number of them did, and probably largely because of the proactive measures deployed in this area. So being proactive about agricultural attractants on private lands can probably have some pretty demonstrable beneficial results in terms of grizzly bear restoration and recovery without that much of an impact on people. So I think, putting this all together, that Gary Larson captured the essence of it in a cartoon from several years back now. So what you have here is a mountain man missing one arm, clearly with a pet grizzly bear talking to a friend. The caption reads, "I raised the old girl from a cub, I did. Of course, we had to get a few things straight between us. She don't try to follow me into town anymore, and I don't try and take her food bowl away until she's done." So again, I think this captures the essence of things. What we have here are two intelligent omnivores, humans and grizzly bears, that if given the chance can learn to live with each other, and with minimal impacts on each other. It just takes sorting a few things out. But I can guarantee you that we will never realize the ample potential that currently exists in central Idaho and elsewhere for supporting grizzly bears if we continue to tell ourselves the kinds of stories that we told ourselves between 1850 and 1950, most insidiously the story of manifest destiny. If we increasingly tell ourselves, or continue to tell ourselves, stories of violence, domination, and intolerance, we will never have more grizzly bears. On the other hand, if, as we have, we increasingly tell ourselves stories of tolerance, accommodation, compassion, respect, and even relatedness, I'm optimistic that we can realize all of that potential in the grizzly bear promised land. That we can have lots more grizzly bears, but not only more grizzly bears, we can also probably have more people in the world. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.